Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be counting down my top 50 favorite songs of 2020. These favorite song lists are always the most difficult that I have to do at the end of every year. Not because there's not enough songs for me to talk about, quite the opposite really. There's oftentimes so many songs to talk about that narrowing it down to a small amount, even just 50 songs for me, is a difficult task to do and oftentimes requires me to make some very difficult cuts, and that was certainly the case for me here today. But in a year like 2020, I especially wanted to share with you guys some really great music. So because of that, I decided to talk about 50 songs here in this year's video as opposed to the smaller amounts I've talked about in previous years, just because I really want to share with you guys some of the best stuff I heard this year. But even still, with me doing that, narrowing this down to just 50 was a very difficult task for me to do. And that was just because, on the whole, 2020 was a really strong year for music. I know plenty of people have said it already in their list and in other videos or just other parts of the internet, but 2020 had a lot of really great music out there. And because of that, there was lots of great songs that were contenders to be on a list like this. And looking back at this list, it's one that I think represents my 2020 pretty well. Of course, just my 2020, obviously, because this is just based on the music I heard, but I think it manages to capture, those songs that are very much about 2020, tackling issues of this year particularly. You also have songs that kind of serve as an escape from all of that, and some oddballs that kind of don't really fit either of those two categories. Believe me, we'll be seeing all of those in today's video. So yeah, I think that really sums up all that general stuff. Moving on to the other rules and things like that for this video. Not really a rule, but the first thing I want to mention is that I'm going to be going into detail only about the top 20 songs here on this list, just to keep this video from being like a 4-hour movie or something like that. As much as I would love to talk about all 50 of these tracks, I don't think anyone out there wants to watch a 4-hour movie of me talking about my favorite songs of 2020. Let's just be honest here. So yeah, I'm narrowing it down to just the top 20 here that I'm going to go in detail about. The first 30 I'm just going to list off, but if you want to hear my reasoning for why I chose them, you could always leave a comment down below asking why, or you could hit me up on Twitter or something like that. I'll feel free to explain if you want to know that badly why I picked any of those first 30. But yeah, for time reasons, I'm sticking to just going into detail about the top 20 here, because this is going to be a long enough video as it is. Moving on to the first actual rule for this list, though, the songs in question here had to have been released in 2020, as in January 1st of 2020 to December 31st of 2020. For that reason, Blinding Lights will not be on this list. I know it's one that's coming up in a lot of people's lists because they probably pick their songs in a different way than I do, but that song dropped as a single in late 2019, so it doesn't count for my list. I love the song. It would be here if it did count, but it doesn't, so it's not here. Aside from that, the second rule for this list is something I kind of alluded to before, but everything here is just based on my own personal opinions and the music that I happen to hear personally in 2020. So if you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. And if your favorite picks aren't here, it doesn't necessarily mean that I don't like them. I might like them and they just may not have made the cut, or it could mean that I like them and I just haven't heard them yet. So feel free to leave those songs in the comment section down below so I can discover those good songs I have yet to hear. Or maybe I just didn't like the song, and there's nothing wrong with that. People have different opinions. The third and final major rule for this list is that I have a one song per project rule, meaning that for every album or EP, there's only one track allowed. And that's just mostly to narrow this list down, because if not, this list would probably have a lot of great songs by the same artists from the same albums, and this list would start to feel a lot, similar to my best albums list that I'm going to be doing next, and that just causes it to be kind of redundant and defeats the the purpose of me sharing with you 50 songs today. I want to give you guys a nice overview of some great songs I heard this year, and if I'm talking about the same few artists over and over again, it's not really that exciting. So with that said, let's get into the first 30 picks that I have on my list. At number 50, I have Karma Come Back by Incubus. At 49, I have Embers by Elder. At 48, I have Happiness by Katie Day. At 47, I have Summer Love from Carly Rae Jepsen. At 46, I have Something to Rap About from Freddie Gibbs and the Alchemist featuring Tyler the Creator. At 45, I have Complicated by Mac Miller. At 44, I have Wizard of the Night from Lord Phobos. At 43, I have Holiday by Lil Nas X. At 42, I have WAP by Cardi B featuring Megan Thee Stallion. At 41, I have Nostalgia by Ulver. Next on the list, I have Pommel Horse from Arm & Hammer featuring Curly Castro. At spot 39 on the list, I have Dream for Hope by Girls' Rituals. At 38, I have Solitude of Enoch by Ka. At 37, I have Be Afraid by Jason Isbell and the 400 Unit. At 36, I have The Flesh of the World by Uboa. At 35, I have Simmer from Hayley Williams. Next, I have Roots from Amine featuring Jid and Charlie Wilson. At 33, I have All My Friends from Creeper. At 32, I have Small Towns from Crisis Sigil. At 31, I have Don't Stop from Megan Thee Stallion featuring Young Thug. At 30, I have Stop Breathing from Playboi Carti. At 29, I have Rainbow Star, Love Is All from Blady. At 28, I have Baby Bull from Brockhampton. Next on the list, I have Do You See Us from Left at London featuring Nobi. At 26, I have Spectre at the Feast from Isan. At 25, I have Underneath from Code Orange. At 24, I have Sihim's Lammet from Liturgy. At 23, I have Don't Worry from Blady. At 22, I have Distanceless Gentleness from Ada Rook. And at spot 21 on the list, I have Open Heart from Debbie McCallion and Katie Day. So that wraps up the first 30 entries on my list. So yeah, I really like all those songs, but unfortunately I don't have time to talk about them in detail. They're all worth checking out though. I highly recommend you do so. But yeah, let's move on to the actual top 20 here that I'm going to be, going into detail about. So yeah, without any further ado, at the number 20 spot on my list. Looks like we're starting the detailed portion of this list with one of the goofier cuts that I have here on this list. Probably the silliest song across all 50 of these tracks I'll be talking about today, but one that I found myself coming back to over and over again since it's first dropped. Ninja Sex Party are, of course, a comedy group, but they're a group that manages to mix comedy with really well-written songs, too, and I think this track is one of the best examples of it. The instrumental here has this almost funk-like influence, and TWRP, the group that does the backing instrumentals for this band, has always played around with funk in their own stuff, but this is the first time, I think, where they're really at large bringing it into a track of Ninja Sex Parties, and I think it goes over really nicely. It kind of reminds me of some of those tracks that the two bands did together on some of TWRP's work that was like more serious music, but if it was like a comedy song instead. The instrumental here is just really well written. The hook on this track is really catchy too. The vocal performances are really solid as well, and the lyrics here are some of the more interesting to come out of this group in recent memory too. I think the lyrics managed to be funny while at the same time being pretty creative too. The song basically talks about having like a girl over at your parents' house, and hijinks ensue pretty much as stuff happens. I don't want to spoil any of the jokes here because I think part of the enjoyment of a track like this is getting to hear those jokes for the first time as you listen through it, but I think they managed to pack in a good amount of jokes into this track, not to the point where it's like distracting from a lot of the other strengths in this song, like the instrumental and the songwriting and the hook work or anything like that, but I think the comedy here makes for this song having a really nice personality to it. It stands out not only as being a funny song in its own right, but also a kind of distinct one within the band's catalog, not only for its sound being a little bit different, but also because I think the lyrics managed to be some of the quirkier and more unique, I guess, within the band's catalog when it comes to their comedy lyrics. So yeah, overall, I really needed some comedy music to unwind at certain points in this year, and this track was just one I had on repeat in times like those. Moving on, though, the next pick I have is a track off the newest EP from JPEG Mafia, and is another really fun track from him as well. A song that I think really showcases a lot of what I like about JPEG Mafia as an artist. His production here on this thing is really cloudy, almost has like an almost like vaporwave-y tone to it at certain points too, which I also thought was pretty cool. JPEG Mafia's rapping here on this track is really great as well. He's got a lot of energy that he brings to this song, and his lyrics here are a ton of fun as well. I wouldn't say that this is one of his more serious tracks in his discography, but it manages to strike a nice balance between having some humor to it, but also managing to say some stuff at the same time. This is one of those songs that I just could not stop listening to once I first heard it. Rico Nasty on this thing is taking like her core sound and infusing it with some really loud, abrasive bubblegum bass type sounds. And the instrumental here on this thing is just pounding. I love how on the hook of this track her vocals are like chipmunked to produce this, effect that in some context I could see some people why they would find it kind of annoying, but I think when it's mixed with this very hard-hitting instrumental and just the context of everything else in this track, it creates like this really massive, almost just like musical equivalent of like a sugar high or something, but like in the best kind of way. This song is just a massive dose of energy that I just find myself coming back to over and over again just because of how addictive it is. I love the hook here on this track and how catchy it is. I think the vocals across this thing are fantastic, whether it be those chipmunk portions I mentioned before or when Rico's doing some of her more natural vocals at points on this track as well. I love how those portions serve as like kind of breathers between the larger, heavier hooks on this song. Overall, this is just a super creative, fun, and energy-filled track that I find myself just coming back to time and time again. And yeah, I only see myself returning to it even more as more time goes on. While Blinding Lights can't be on this list because of the rules I have set up for lists like these, doesn't mean that another track from The Weeknd can't, and considering the quality of his newest record as a whole, I mean, it was bound to happen somewhere in this top 50, and In Your Eyes is just another fantastic pop song from him that's deserving of a spot on a list like this. I love how this track keeps a lot of that synth-driven sound that's present on most of After Hours, but it also mixes in some like funkier tones too, which I found to be really cool. It gives this track a really unique sound when compared to anything else he's really done before for the most part. And his vocal performances here on this track are just killer as well. I mean, that's pretty much always the case when it comes to The Weeknd because he's a really great vocalist, but on this track in particular, he sounds fantastic. I love how he's able to sound more restrained during the verses here, but during the hook, he's able to come together with the more explosive part of the instrumental deliver. Just a super catchy, infectious hook. I mean, while it's not quite as great as Blinding Lights in my opinion, it's still, a fantastic pop song. And the fact that this song wasn't quite as big as Blinding Lights almost disappoints me in a sense because I feel like it's almost just as great as that track. And I think that this song deserved to be maybe a little bigger than it was. I know it got quite a good amount of attention thrown its way and all. It wasn't like underrated by any means, but yeah, still, I think that this is a phenomenal pop song and one that's deserving of a lot of attention. Just a super catchy track, one I've returned to time and time again since first hearing it. If you haven't heard this song for whatever reason, what are you doing with your life? Check it out. In addition to being on this list earlier for providing background instrumentation for that Ninja Sex Party song I was talking about a bit before, TWRP also made this list themselves with a track of their own, a track that also features Danny from Ninja Sex Party providing some of the vocals here on this thing. And this is just a phenomenal song from these guys, one of the best and most unique tracks that they've put out thus far, and one that feels like a nice culmination of a lot of the ideas that this group has played around with over their entire career really up to this point. This is a track that sees the band still playing around with the synth rock and synth funk that they've always played around with, but pushing it in a bit more of a progressive direction. This track almost reminds me of like those classic progressive rock songs that are lengthy with multiple parts to them, only this time instead of being like a bluesy classic rock track, it's the synth funk or synth rock song instead. I love the different portions of this track, whether it be some of the more straightforward rock stuff on this thing, or like the middle portion of the song, which features these more aggressive, electronic-tinged instrumentals, and these kind of manipulated vocals from Dr. Sung 2, which have this kind of evil sound to them, but not like a serious kind of evil, more like this Saturday morning cartoon kind of evil that provides this fun overall feel to the track. It's just an amazing song from these guys. The hook work on this thing is really catchy, all the vocals are really nice, and I just love how this feels like it's taking everything that made this band great before, but also pushing it even further into a new direction too, because these guys, well, I think, maybe a track like Starlight Brigade, for example, had a similar epic quality to it. It wasn't quite as grand and large and, adventurous as this track is, and honestly, I wouldn't even mind getting a full album of tracks like this, or just lengthier more adventurous pieces from these guys, because I think they have the chops to actually do it if this song is any indication. But, for right now, with just this one track, I think it's a pretty solid song from these guys, and one that I've certainly come back to time and time again. Check it out. I've seen quite a few people already at this point on their own list include tracks from the newest Open Mike Eagle record. Usually it's the song Everything Ends Last Year, which almost made this list. It was a very tough call between that song and the one that I actually went with. But at the end of the day, I decided to go with the Black Mirror episode instead for a few reasons. I think one of those being that this track just feels a bit more, unique. And not to say that the other track isn't super unique and interesting in its own right too, but this one feels unique in a way that also manages to encompass a lot of what I think the newest Open Mike Eagle record was trying to go for. The record Anime Trauma and Divorce. And I think this track here manages to have a little bit of all of that. Technically not really any anime because Black Mirror isn't an anime, but it's still, like a piece of media, and that's kind of what the album is getting at, generally speaking, so it still works here in the context of this song. This song is basically about how an episode of Black Mirror ruined Open Mike Eagle's marriage, and that sounds like a kind of ridiculous concept, and I'm sure Open Mike Eagle himself is a little bit aware of the fact that the Black Mirror episode didn't literally ruin his marriage as much as it maybe served as a catalyst towards his divorce, but I think that this track manages to tell a really interesting story with this narrative, a story about how media can, have profound impacts on people, but not always for the better necessarily. We get plenty of pieces of work, or even like video essays and things of that sort, or things like that, just talking about how the positive impacts that various forms of media and art have had on people. It's kind of rare though that you see people talking about the negatives, so they certainly do exist. And a track like this, I think, does a really interesting job at highlighting that. You get a lot of that anxiousness here in this song, a lot of that trauma described in the album title that this song comes from. Open Mike Eagle genuinely feels really nervous and upset here on this track, very distraught over the fact that the Black Mirror episode ruined his marriage. And it's just very heartbreaking in one sense, but at the same time almost morbidly humorous too, because the concept is just kind of ridiculous, admittedly. The Black Mirror episode ruining your marriage, like an episode of a TV show ruining a marriage, something like that. It just seems ridiculous, but when you actually look at what he's trying to get at here through the lyrics of this track, I think he does a really good job at showing how, he went into this episode expecting things to be all jolly and happy and fine, but came out of it just in a completely different state, the state that he's still in and recovering from throughout the course of his newest record. And yeah, that's just a really interesting topic in my opinion, one that really stuck with me even after I gave that album its initial run of listens, and for that reason I've just come back to this track in particular over and over again since I first heard Anime Trauma and Divorce. So yeah, interesting concept here, one that maybe at times even hit a little bit too close to home throughout parts of 2020 for reasons, but yeah, this is a great track. Check it out. This song serves as the conclusion to the newest full-length record from Ada Rook under her own name, and it's a song that does a lot of things that I love from closing tracks. It has this big cathartic release involved with it that I find to be really appealing. I think it showcases a lot of what makes Rook's music really interesting on it. I think her vocals on this track are fantastic, whether it be some of the more quiet moments here on this song or the more aggressive, shouty moments in this thing too. You really get the full range of what her vocals can do just on this one track. And the instrumental here too is similarly multifaceted, whether it be some of the more quiet moments or some of the louder, more distorted moments here. It all works together to give you this nice emotional release of energy that I just find really great. And this is a song that, all things considered, feels in one sense massive, but at the same time very personal and intimate too. And I have to wonder if in some regards that has to do with the lyrics of this track, kind of talking about a moment, just, a small moment feeling like an ocean, something very large and massive. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but I found the comparison between that concept that runs throughout the lyrics of the track and the general feel of this song to be kind of interesting, and it just makes the song even more engaging in my opinion. Overall, this is some really interesting indie pop, one that certainly may not be for everyone given the intensity involved here, but if you like good cathartic music like this, it's worth checking out. This track is a great collaboration between the Gorillaz and Robert Smith, one that showcases the strengths of both of these artists, but is also a song that manages to become better by combining the sounds of these two artists together into this one track. You have the synth pop side of the Gorillaz on display here in this track. The synth work here is really great. It has this almost like danceable feel to it, which I also really like. And I like how it's used together with the more gothic side of the sound of this track, which is mostly brought in by Robert Smith, whether it be with his vocals or just the general tone of the lyrics here on this track too, which are mostly talking about the strange times that we're living in 2020. Really doesn't really need much explaining outside of that, considering you lived through 2020, you know what I'm talking about. And one thing about the lyrics here in this track is that they're not, necessarily the most specific or detailed out of any of the tracks I've heard this year. They managed to strike this nice balance, though, between detail and leaving enough vagueness there so that you're mostly just enveloped in that general idea of living in, strange times. I feel like this is almost like a theme song, in a sense, to like a TV show. Like, if my life in 2020 was a TV show, this would be the theme song. Like, it just fits perfectly with the slightly upbeat sound that also has this slightly darker undertone to it, and the lyrics that, if you really pay attention to them, have a bit more of depth to them than you might expect, with some darker undertones to that as well. It's just like perfect theme song material, and it was certainly the theme song to my 2020 in a sense, and it's one that I'll definitely be coming back to going forward. This is another track here on my list, which is a collaboration, and much like the last pick on the list, it's one of those collaborations that's made better by having these two artists collaborating together and doing something great when it comes to combining their sounds. This might even be my favorite song to come out of either of these two artists, just because of how creative and unique these sounds are when put together. Of course, you have that heavy, kind of thick industrial sound that was present throughout most of the newest Bring Me the Horizon EP that this track comes from here on this song. And when it comes to the vocals that Bring Me the Horizon bring to this track, they're a bit harsher, a bit heavier, and then Baby Metal are bringing in the catchier side of their sound through that J-pop influence that they have. And the melding of these two sounds, the kind of heavy industrial pop metal mixed with the J-pop metal, it's an interesting sound and one that works really nicely. I love the heavy moments on this thing and how they compare to some of the lighter, catchier moments. These two artists have great chemistry here on this track. It's a collaboration that I for sure did not see coming, but one that I just think works fantastically well, and I hope someday in the future we'll get more songs that sound like this. I mean, I don't know if there's any bands willing to combine sounds quite like this going forward, but I hope there is, because this song is so very good. Check this thing out for sure. One of the most interesting metal tracks I've heard in recent memory. For the next pick on the list, I have this Rina Sawayama track, Excess, and this was just a fantastic pop song overall, and a really interesting one too. I mean, most of her newest album is really interesting pop songs, but this one stood out to me as my favorite from the bunch. The instrumental here to this track is really interesting, really dynamic. There's quite a lot going on in it. You have some of those heavier rock guitars coming at points on this track to add a little bit of emphasis to certain points of this thing, but other parts of this track have, a more typical like 2000s electropop type sound to it. Rina's vocals here on this thing are fantastic. The hook to this track is just incredibly catchy, and this song also has some really interesting lyrics to it as well. It's not one of those pop songs that's just interesting, on like a surface level or anything like that. There's quite a lot of depth here to this song, with Rina really talking about the idea of excess when it comes to money and people's desire to own a lot of things and spend lots of money and just, really get lost in consumerism in a way that's really unhealthy, and just about how our society that we live in is really driven a lot by consumerism to a really unhealthy extent. It's a song where if you really dive into the lyrics, there's quite a lot going on here, but on the surface you also get this really catchy, fun, well-produced, and really interesting sounding pop song. So yeah, I mean, definitely check this thing out. It's super creative, super fun, but also at the same time really interesting and deep too. It's one that needs to be heard for sure. The newest record from Clipping was a project that had quite a lot of great songs on it, but even from my first listen, I knew Enlacing was a really special track. I love how this has a lot of what made their newest record, as well as its companion piece that dropped the year prior, really interesting, but it takes it in a slightly different direction, which gives this track a really distinct personality. In the lyrics here of this song, the band is still tackling important political and social issues, but at the same time, mixing it together with horror. But of course, that was the general concept they were going for on both of their most recent releases. But here on this track, they're more specifically tackling cosmic horror in a way unlike any of the other songs on that duology of records, which gives this thing a bit of an interesting sound and style from a lyrical perspective. And I love the really hazy, cloudy, almost psychedelic sound that this track has going for it throughout its run. I especially love like those background vocals that are going on throughout the track and how dreamy and distorted they sound. I love the hook of this track where Diggs is giving this kind of deadpan but also really catchy delivery for the hook here on this song. I love the instrumental here on this thing and how just out there it sounds. It certainly stands out as being a super unique cut, even amongst a bunch of super unique songs from that duology of records. This is just a really fantastic Clipping cut, which also has some really fantastic storytelling, really detailed lyricism, fantastic flows from Diggs again. The production here on this thing is amazing. Overall, Clipping put out quite a lot of great songs in the past couple of years over those two records, and while I loved all of those songs, this stood out as one of the highlights. So definitely check this thing out, or more specifically rather, check out those two records as a whole because they're fantastic. This track here is some peak Run the Jewels material and easily my favorite track of theirs off their newest release. A track that I think showcases a lot of what makes this duo really powerful and potent, whether it be the production, the actual rapping itself, or the really powerful politically charged lyrics. And yes, this is the point in the video where we're going to get to some pretty politically charged songs, but I mean, 2020 called for it and artists responded appropriately. But before we get into that though, let's talk about some of the other aspects of this track that I really adore. The rapping from Killer Mike and LP on this thing is fantastic. They give some of their best performances ever here on this track. LP's production here is some of the finest he's put out to date too. Gangsta Boo's uncredited feature on this song is really great as well. And when it comes down to those lyrics I mentioned before, yeah, they are some of the most powerful to come out in the past year. For example, on LP's verse, he's talking about how higher up people in society don't really care for those beneath them and how these people need to band together in order to protect themselves and stay safe. He's talking about how, like fake Christian people, for example, those who, pass off their actions as being in the name of something like Christianity when their actions don't reflect it whatsoever. Stuff, like people putting people in cages, things like that. And then you have Killer Mike's verse, which is even more potent somehow than LP's verse here on this thing, getting more specifically into black issues, even going as far as to talk about being murdered by a police officer, saying things like he can't breathe. And while this might sound like something inspired by the murder of George Floyd, this track was actually written before that happened, released around the same time, a little bit after, but written beforehand. And I think this just really concisely demonstrates how these issues have been going on for years and years, and how, the stuff that happened in 2020 was really just, a breaking point of sorts, the one that got a lot of people talking, got a lot of people doing stuff, but when in reality this stuff has been happening for a very long time now, and that's the kind of stuff that, Run the Jewels have talked about in their music before. And here on this track, it's just one of the most clear-cut examples of them talking about this stuff. Some of the most potent lyrics in their discography, for sure. Not just, as Run the Jewels, but really in both of these artists' discographies as a whole as well. And I mean, when the rapping here is as great as it is, great as it is, and when the production here on this thing is as fantastic as it is too, and the feature is great as well, you just get, a fantastic song, one of the most potent from 2020 for sure. Check it out. Picking just a single cut from the newest Black Dresses record was one of the tougher decisions I had to make for this video. Black Dresses is the collaborative project from Ada Rook and Debbie McCallion, two names that should be somewhat familiar to you if you watched this video up to this point, because both of those artists appeared previously on the list for some songs that they dropped on other projects this year. But this song here is my favorite track to come out of either artist this year. Just a real powerhouse of a track. And while it was a difficult choice to pick just this one out of a pool of really great projects from Peaceful as Hell, this was the one that I think stood out to me as being the greatest. I love the really noisy instrumental here on this thing. I love how when it gets to the hook of the track, it has a little bit more of a melodic sound to it. It creates this very disorienting, frantic sound that I just find myself enamored with. The vocals here on this track are fantastic as well, whether it be Rook's really harsh vocals here or Debbie's more distant vocals that come in during the hook of the track. And I really love the lyrics here on the song as well, kind of talking about perceiving oneself, being unsure of who oneself is, just kind of comparing yourself to various other people maybe that you see in TV or something along those lines, wanting maybe other people to tell you what to be because you're unsure of what you want to be. And just, I guess, more generally speaking, the confusion that comes around that concept of one's identity. And it's just really well written here on this thing, and you can really feel that nervousness, that anxiousness, and that frantic nature of it all come across in the vocal deliveries here on this thing, the lyrics, as well as the instrumental here. And when all those things come together, you just get a fantastic song. Yeah, Black Dresses had a really fantastic year, whether it be with their newest record or, just when it comes to both artists as individual acts too. And this track here was my favorite to come out of both artists this year. So yeah, just a fantastic song overall. As I said in my best EPs of the year list, the newest EP from Zeal and Ardor is one of the best projects to come out in all of 2020. And I specifically talked about this one track there in that video. And I guess in a sense I was getting a little bit ahead of myself because a lot of what I said there was stuff I wanted to say here too, but I guess I'm going to repeat it here because this is a track that's certainly worth talking about. Another one of those songs that's more politically driven, this time more explicitly about the murder of George Floyd as well as the Black Lives Matter protests that happened following that. And this song here is just an emotional gut punch of a track. Like I said when I'm talking about this EP in my list for best EPs, this opens up their newest EP. And while most EPs or albums open up with maybe a really energetic song or something really catchy, this track is a lot more somber. It's a lot slower. It's a bit more plodding in nature, but it's one of those songs that really hits you when it comes to the lyrics and what it's talking about. It feels very important in that sense. The band really strips away any sort of heaviness or harsh vocals that they've used in other songs in the past here on this song, I think mostly to have you focus on the lyrics here in this track. And of course, that's not to say that the instrumental or the vocal performances on this thing are weak. Far from it. The instrumental here is fantastic. It pairs with the flow of this track really nicely, and the vocal performance here is just gut-wrenching as well. But again, I feel like they mostly want you to focus on the lyrics here in this track, because the lyrics here to this song, like I said before, are some of the most clear-cut and emotional that I've heard concerning this subject matter this year. This is one of those tracks that not only, of course, is talking about this stuff in a literal sense, but it's a track that's clearly meant to elicit an emotional reaction from the listener too. It's a track that when you listen to it, you really just gotta focus on this one track. It's a track that's gonna make you focus on it when you listen to it. It's hard to listen to a song like this and what it's talking about, especially with the vocal delivery and the instrumental, and just like do something else in the background or something like that. It's just something I could not do when listening to this EP. It's a song that demands your full attention, and if you give it that full attention, you're going to get a lot out of it, because like I said before, the performances on this thing are really great, the lyrics are some of the most potent I heard all year, and the vocal performances are some of the finest I heard this year as well. Overall, this is just a phenomenal track that really showcases the power that this band has going for them. This is a name in metal that you need to have your eyes on if you don't already, because they're putting out fantastic stuff, and this track here is a prime example of why. Backwash put out quite a bit of really fantastic music this year, and the title track from her newest EP was one of the best tracks of the year in my opinion. Honestly, this might be one of my favorite rap metal songs ever, just because of how entertaining and interesting it is as well. I really love Backwash's approach to rap metal here on this song, taking some original instrumentation and mixing it together with some sampled Christian metal bands too, to create a really interesting metal hip-hop fusion for the instrumental here on this thing. It's very heavy, very hard-hitting, but at the same time really creative as well. I haven't heard anything in the world of rap metal that sounds exactly like this instrumental, or really any of the instrumentals from this EP does. And Backwash herself gives a fantastic performance on this track as well. She has a lot of energy here, a lot of passion through her delivery here as well. The hook on this track is one of the best in her entire discography. Super catchy, super memorable, and it really just helps tie this track together as being a really memorable rap metal track. It's very hard-hitting, again, like I said before. All the performances here on this thing are really great. A super creative track as well. I mean, like I said in my best EPs video where I talked about the EP this track is from, I know rap metal is a bit of a hard sell to people, especially these days, given that the genre doesn't exactly have the best reputation to it. But Backwash's approach to it here on this EP, and in this song in particular, is one that is very unique, very different from anything I've heard before in the genre. And even if rap metal isn't really your thing, I think you definitely need to check out this song, because it is a fantastic track, and I'm hoping we get more material like this in the future. If not from Backwash, maybe by some other artist that'll tap into a sound like this, because this is super creative and cool sounding. You need to hear this. This is one of the more straightforward pop tracks on this list, but one that I think very much deserves to be here, because it's one of the best electropop songs I've heard in recent memory, and one of the best tracks Charlie has dropped in recent memory too. I love how on this song she's able to take a lot of what made her previous music great, but twist it and put it in a slightly different direction too. This was the lead single from her newest record, and whereas a lot of her previous releases over the previous few years had a bit more of a glossy and super sleek sound to them, this track has a bit more of a rough sound, not to the point where it's like really harsh or industrial or anything like that, but it gives the track a little bit more of an intimate feel that previous songs from her didn't really have, because of the super sleek production that was on those tracks. Not that I disliked that sound on previous releases or anything, but I just really appreciated how this track introduced this slightly new sound to her style too. And while you could say that sound is also present on all the other songs from her newest record, and it makes that a little bit less unique here in the context of just this song by itself, the fact that this was the lead single, I always associate this little switch up in sound as being associated to this track because of it. And also, whereas I really liked the rest of her newest record, I thought all the other songs on that thing were great, I also felt like this track in particular stood out to me just because of how fantastic her own performance on this thing is too. Her vocals sound great here, really smooth, really beautiful, and the hook to this track is one of the most memorable that I heard this year, and probably one of the most sticky and unforgettable in her entire discography. All things considered, Forever is just a masterpiece of an electropop track, one of the most interesting that Charlie has dropped so far. It really helps us demonstrate why she's one of the biggest names in this scene right now. And yeah, If you haven't heard this thing already, give it a listen, because if you like this kind of music, you won't regret it. Picking just one track from the newest Spanish Love Songs album was a very difficult task in my opinion, because there were so many great songs on that record and they all appealed to me in very different ways with their lyrics, but ultimately I decided to stick with the track that I felt like was the most, universally appealable, I guess, to me, because this was just the song from the record that I could find myself coming back to over and over again, despite my mood and despite what was bothering me at any given point. It's a track that I think is really relatable to a lot of different people, just because this track lyrically deals with the concept of, optimism, living in a world where being optimistic is really difficult, and after a year like 2020, I mean, do I really need to explain why being optimistic through times like these isn't necessarily the easiest? And probably the funniest part about this all is that this track dropped before most of what 2020 had in store for us really set in. This entire album that this song came from dropped in February of last year. And I think that really helps showcase how even before 2020, a lot of these problems that people have dealt with over the past year or so, they were still there in a lot of ways, and that just adds to a lot of the negativity of this track. The fact that the narrator here of this song is very clearly aware of the fact that the world that they're living in isn't really heading in all that great of a direction, and there's not much that they could do about it, and it doesn't really seem like anybody else is stepping up to do anything about it either. Yet there's still plenty of people out there telling this narrator to be optimistic and things of that sort, and to look up for the future and all of that. And yet it's very hard to feel that way, given how bad things could be. And especially after living through a year like 2020, yeah, it is very hard to be optimistic for the future when things seem as bad as they are. And yeah, I get the sense when listening to this track that the narrator wants to almost be optimistic and hopeful despite what they actually feel. They want to believe that things won't actually be this bleak forever. They want to, someday believe that things will get better, and yet, they can't really come to fully commit to that here in the context of just this track. And while that might seem inconclusive to some people, I think it's part of the appeal of a track like this, just because, well, I mean, who really does feel concrete in their optimism in, times like these, honestly? I mean, I think that this track really captures that anxiousness and that unease of living in tough times like these, unlike any other track this year really did. So yeah, the lyrics here were very relatable, to say the very least, and I think it's going to be the case for you too, especially if you happen to fall into the age range of being like a millennial or an older Gen Z person, maybe even a younger Gen Z person as well. I think this track is just going to have a very, widespread appeal with that demographic just because of its lyrics. And of course, this song isn't just on the list for the lyrics. Everything else here is fantastic as well. The instrumental is great. All the performances are excellent. The vocals here sound fantastic. And the hook is incredibly catchy. It's one of those hooks that you want to sing along to every time, not just because the lyrics are super relatable, but also because it is just an incredibly fun song to sing along to because of how it's structured and all of that. So yeah, just a fantastic piece of music to come out this year. One that, again, if you're in that demographic I mentioned before, you definitely need to check this out. Yep, Backwash has 2 songs on this list. This pick here comes from the album that she dropped in 2020. Also shares a name with the song I happened to pick. Kind of funny that both picks from both of her projects from 2020 happen to share the same name as the project that they're from. That wasn't intentional, just a weird coincidence. But either way, this is a really fantastic cut, and one that I just found myself instantly hooked on when I first heard it, when I sat down to listen to this album in full. This was the first track on the album, and from the first few seconds of listening to this thing, I knew I was going to be in for something really great. The song starts out using a sample taken from the Black Sabbath song Black Sabbath. It's the portion of the track where Ozzy Osbourne is, asking God to help him. His voice sounds very nervous and anxious and scared in a kind of way that I've never really heard replicated on a song before. I love that original Black Sabbath track because of how genuinely scared Ozzy sounds at points on that song. And I love how it's recontextualized here in the context of this song too. Not only is like the instrumental of this track using that sample to great effect, and it's like mixed together really well. It sounds really nice to the ear and all of that, but how it's like worked into the concept of the song itself is also really interesting. The lyrics here on this project act almost like a thesis statement of sorts for like the full record that this track is tied to, because conceptually it tackles a lot of the same issues, maybe in a more general scope. The general concept of forgiveness is definitely on display here in this track, as it is in all the other songs on the record. But I like how here there's also a focus put on revenge and mental health. It's all really nicely tied together in the one nice verse that you get here in this track. And once again, I really like how it's used together with the sample here on the track, because of course the sample has Ozzy asking God for help, and you could see how that ties in with the general concept of the record asking for forgiveness, and of course how God works into things as well. I mean, just take a look at the title of the track and album. You could see how it all ties together into this super well put together concept. And I really like how this track is able to accomplish this all within a relatively short and concise runtime too. Like, this song is only a couple minutes long, and yet it still feels like there's so much going on in it, despite the fact that it's a relatively straightforward song. Like I said, just a single verse. You got that sample going on too. It's pretty straightforward, pretty to the point, but really, really powerful as well. This was another one of those records that it was really hard to pick just one song to include on this list, because there was plenty of other tracks on that record that I felt like could very easily slide onto a list like this, and I could give lots of solid justifications as for why, but this track was just the one that probably stuck out to me the most. Overall, a great track from a great album that, if you haven't heard already, change that. In my opinion, Panopticon has been one of the most interesting names in black metal over like the past decade or so, with a really solid discography under this project's belt. This is a project that if you're unfamiliar with it and you like black metal, you should certainly change that. But I feel like Rune's Heart here, this track I'm talking about, is one of the best songs to come out of this project yet. It's a track that encompasses a lot of what I like from this project, but at the same time has a lot of new and interesting things going for it as well, particularly in the lyrics and concept of this track, because, oh boy, this is an emotional one here on the list. This track is about the son of the sole member of Panopticon, who had a heart condition, surgery following that, other complications, and this track is essentially an emotional response, in a sense, to that event. As you might expect, the track itself is a pretty big emotional gut punch. I mean, you could really feel it in the delivery of the vocals here on this track, whether it be the aggressive black metal shrieks or the more pained, clean singing that pops up on this thing. You could really feel that emotion seeping through in the vocals. And I mean, even though there is no official release of lyrics here for this track, rather there's just a description put up on the Bandcamp page for this release that goes into detail about what the track is about. I highly recommend you read that little description if you're going to listen to this track, because it does explain some things in more detail than I am here, just for the sake of time. But it's an interesting read, and the lyrics are kept hidden just because of how personal they are. You could make out some of the lyrics at points here on the song, but due to how harsh some of the other vocals here are, it's a bit difficult. But I love how, even though that's the case, you could still just really feel the emotion here on the song. You could just really just get it all just based on the vocals and the performances alone. And when it comes to the instrumentals here on this track, again, like I said before, it feels like a nice culmination of a lot of what this project has done before. You have those atmospheric black metal moments. You have those moments that lean a bit folkier or a bit more country tinged too. And I love how these different portions of the track flow together so nicely. This song is over 20 minutes long. It's the lengthiest song in my top 50 by a large amount, and yet it feels like one that never really feels all that bloated or lengthy or anything along those lines. It's one that uses its entire runtime to great effect, and it really, like I said before, it encapsulates a lot of what makes this particular artist great, while at the same time adding a really unique, personal and emotional touch as well, given the lyrics are on the track. And by the way, if you're wondering, the particular story behind this record does have a happy ending to it. His son is okay, all things considered. If you read through that little blurb on Bandcamp, it goes into more detail about that. So that is, I guess, a silver lining following this very emotional track, if you were curious. But yeah, this is just a phenomenal black metal track. Like I said before, Panopticon has been one of my favorite acts in black metal over the past few years, an artist that has put out many great albums and songs, in my opinion, some of the best in the genre over the past few years, in my opinion, as well. And yet, Rune's Heart still stands out as being one of the finest songs to come out of this project, too. There's no other track out there quite like this one, and that combined with, everything I've already said about the song just makes for an incredibly unique yet wonderful experience. Certainly an emotional track as well, but, that's oftentimes where the best music lies, in my opinion, in that really emotional, potent stuff. And now we reach the number one spot on the list. I know I sound like a broken record at this point saying this, but this was a tough list for me to put together. And picking a number one song for this list was one of the toughest choices I had to make. In fact, out of all the best song lists that I've made on this channel over the years for my year-end list, this was easily the hardest time that I've had picking a number one song, just because the competition here was just really, really good. And ultimately, I felt like, a lot of the songs here on this list, especially like in the top 10 or so here, could have easily been like number one songs for me. Yet, ultimately, I decided to go with the track that I ended up picking here. So I guess without any further ado, let's get to that song. This is Clipping's second appearance here on this list, but a well-deserved appearance too. You might expect that this song would be, in some senses, similar to the tracks that appeared on the album they dropped this year, or the album that they dropped in 2019, given that, this dropped in between those two records, and those two records were very similar to each other thematically. But that's not really the case here for this track. This song was made in response to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, as well as the Black Lives Matter protest that followed immediately after that. And it's a protest song, if that's not already obvious, and probably the best protest song that we got in all of 2020, and definitely one of the most potent tracks of the year, one of the most potent protest songs of the year, probably just one of the most potent protest songs ever, really. It's a track that I'm constantly amazed by its ability to get across what it's trying to get across, with what it's working with here, because, this isn't necessarily a super out there Clipping song by any means. The runtime is pretty standard for this group. Instrumentally, the group is still playing around with their noisy brand of hip-hop, though admittedly here on this track it feels a little bit more subdued to allow for the vocals and, of course, the lyrics to really take the center stage. But here on this track, the lyrics here are really what make this track what it is. One thing that I really love about this track is that it's a song that manages to be very straightforward, very easy to understand, very to the point, but at the same time, there's just so much going on here in the lyrics of the track. The group manages to cover so much ground with the lyrics here on this song when it comes to everything that was going on last summer in regards to the protest and all of that. Everything about that it feels like it was all compacted here into the lyrics of this track, and yet the group isn't really like sacrificing detail or emotional weight in the process of fitting all of this into one song. You would expect a very general track covering a lot of, things to feel maybe not quite as potent because it's not quite as specific. Most protest songs tend to really focus on like one specific aspect of something and just go all in on it, but that's not exactly the case here. It feels more like Clipping are taking the entirety of, what was going on last summer, and yet they're still delivering the same amount of detail and emotional potency despite speaking at times more generally here on this thing. And it's just really, really goes to show what a fantastic storyteller Daveed Diggs is, and what a fantastic rapper he is too. The way that he's able to be so blunt and to the point, yet at the same time so emotionally potent. It's something that, you know, you don't really get from most artists out there, so you really have to appreciate it when an artist like him and, you know, the rest of Clipping come about and are able to make a song like this. And one thing I really appreciate about this song is that, you know, it was very potent and powerful back when it initially dropped for obvious reasons, but now even months later, it still is very powerful, you know, not only because all the problems that the group talks about on this song are still very much problems today, unfortunately, but also because, like I said before, the storytelling here is just so potent and powerful that it's a song that grips me every time I go to listen to it. You know, when I first listened to this back in June, it was one of those tracks where I just knew it was something special upon the first listen. Even, you know, in a year where we got tons of great protest songs, tons of great politically charged pieces of music, and, you know, I've talked about some of those already on the list, and I love all those tracks for their own reasons, but I felt like this one was a step above the rest, just with how powerful it was. And even coming back to it for this video, I was listening to it again and again, and, you know, every time I go to listen to this thing, even now, it still feels like something special to me. You know, if you really want one track that defines that moment in history when it was released, I think that this is the best track to do it, just because, again, the storytelling here, the level of detail, the ground covered by the group, it's, you know, just the emotional power of it all and the delivery, it's unmatched here on this thing, even in a year where the competition was very good. So, yeah, this was my number one pick. Not exactly a super happy number one pick, but, I mean, 2020 was not a super happy year by any means. It was a year filled with a lot of suffering, a year filled with a lot of learning, hopefully, for some people. And, you know, I think in a lot of ways, this track, it kind of embodies that to some extent, at least from the political unrest side of things, because, like I said before, this feels like a special track, a special protest song, if you will, one that hopefully will be remembered for many, many years to come. And with all that said, that really sums up everything I had to share with you guys in today's video. That's my full list. And again, this was certainly a big one, but I felt like it was worth it because I really wanted to share with you guys a good amount of picks from 2020 that were worth checking out, because, like I also said before, 2020 was just a fantastic year for music with a lot of really fantastic songs. So if you haven't heard any of these songs yet, you know, make an effort to check them out, especially if they happen to appeal to your interest or anything like that. Though I'm sure all of you guys certainly have lists of your own for your favorite songs that are nothing like my list, so feel free to drop those in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, discussion videos, list videos, of course. I'm in the middle of doing my 2020 year-end list. My best albums are going to be coming out soon. I've already done my best EPs and my worst albums, so make sure you check those out as well. Yeah, I think that really sums up everything I had to share with you guys today. So again, thank you for watching this lengthy video once again, and stay golden.